Hello, weary traveller. I am the Lonely Knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about how peasants endured the long winters of medieval Europe when hunger and cold pressed hardest against their frail existence. I will guide you through what truly happened in those times, the struggles, the faith, the hunger, and the resilience that shaped the lives of those who came before us. Now, make yourself comfortable, for the story is about to begin. And tell me, if you will, I am always curious, from where do you listen tonight? And what hour marks your world as these words reach you? The first chill of winter was never just a matter of frost upon the fields. It was a warning of empty stomachs and long nights where the silence of hunger gnawed louder than wolves in the forest. I remember how entire villages braced themselves for the lean months, storing what little they could, praying it would last until spring returned with mercy. Yet year after year, manorial rolls and chronicles recorded the same pattern. Death rising sharply when winter lingered too long. Hunger was not an exception. It was a season, expected and endured. Grain bins stood as the measure of life itself. Those who had harvested well lived with a fragile comfort, while those whose fields had failed faced dread each time bread was sliced thinner. The poorest households often ran out first, forcing mothers to ration scraps while their children cried. In England, France, and across the German lands, records from abbeys and courts speak of people begging, stealing, or collapsing by the roadside, their bodies weakened by months without nourishment. This cycle became known as the hungry gap, when the stored food of the past harvest had dwindled and the new crops were not yet ready. It fell most cruelly between February and April, when the cold lingered, livestock was thin, and seed grain could not be touched without risking next year's planting. Archaeological digs reveal bones of peasants marked by malnutrition, their growth stunted, their teeth worn by coarse bread. The hungry gap was etched not only in memory, but in the very bodies left behind. Villages carried this weight together, though not all felt it equally. Lords and monasteries had greater reserves, while peasants bore the brunt of shortage. The records of bishops and stewards note how death rates climbed among the landless labourers, those who worked for daily wages with no granaries of their own. It is they who often perished unseen, buried quietly in churchyards when the ground thawed enough to receive them. The hunger of winter was rarely sudden. It came like a slow, tightening rope. Families stretched broth thinner each day, mixed husks into flour, and prayed for miracles at the parish altar. The monotony of empty meals sapped not only the body, but the spirit. Those who survived learned patience, resilience, and a grim acceptance that each winter might claim someone they loved. Such endurance was not heroic. It was simply necessary. I recall that mortality was not only from starvation itself, but from its companions, cold, weakness, and disease. Dysentery swept easily through weakened bodies, and influenza spread quickly in cramped huts, where warmth came only from shared breath and damp smoke. What the chroniclers noted most was the sharp rise of burials in late winter, a rhythm familiar to priests who read the same prayers over countless graves. Yet even in the darkest hours, faith gave strength. Parish bells tolled for fasting and processions as villagers sought divine mercy. Hunger was interpreted as a punishment or a test, though within this belief lay a kind of hope, that endurance had meaning, that suffering was not in vain. And so, even as their bodies weakened, the people's trust in God carried them forward, one meager meal at a time. When spring finally broke and the first shoots appeared in the fields, the survivors knew they had crossed a threshold few could take for granted. Relief was always mixed with grief, for hunger had claimed its share. But life continued, and the cycle reset, each family keenly aware that the harsh reality of winter hunger would one day return again. Life in the villages of medieval Europe was measured not by clocks, but by the turning of the seasons and the rhythm of the soil. The year began with ploughing and sowing, when oxen dragged heavy wooden ploughs through damp earth, leaving furrows for seeds of rye, barley, or wheat. Every hand, young and old, took part, for survival depended on the success of these fields. The harvest months seemed distant in spring, yet all knew that the coming winter's fate was already sealed in how well those first seeds took root. Summer brought both hope and labor. Weeding, watering, and tending crops were relentless duties, with women and children often bent for hours in the fields. Any misstep, any sudden weather change threatened disaster. Too much rain rotted grain, too little left stalks brittle and empty. It was a fragile gamble, and every peasant understood the risk. Their daily prayers were filled with pleas for balance, neither flood nor drought, neither frost nor scorching sun. By late August or early September, the harvest arrived. This was the most critical season of all, for the work of months culminated in days of urgent labor. Entire communities joined together in reaping, binding sheaves, and carrying grain to barns and granaries. The air hummed with both relief and exhaustion, for what was gathered then had to last until the next harvest came. Those fortunate enough to see abundance gave thanks, while the less fortunate already carried fear for the winter ahead. It was not only the fields that mattered. Livestock followed the same yearly rhythm, with calves born in spring and animals fattened through summer pastures. Sheep provided wool, goats gave milk, and pigs were raised for eventual slaughter. Yet fodder needed to be stored as carefully as grain, for hungry animals could mean the loss of next year's strength in the fields. A failed hay crop or shortage of straw could be just as ruinous as a failed harvest. Records from manorial accounts show how closely lords monitored these cycles. Rents were demanded at fixed times, often just after the harvest, when grain could be measured and taken. For peasants, it was a painful irony. At the very moment abundance was gathered, much of it left their hands as payment. What remained had to be stretched through the coming year, a reminder that their survival was always tied to powers beyond their control. The calendar of the church intertwined with the agrarian year, marking both work and rest. Feasts of saints, holy days, and fasting periods gave rhythm to the toil, offering moments of relief and communal gathering. Yet these celebrations also heightened awareness of dependence on God's will, for no ritual, however pious, could change the harsh truth if weather turned against them. Still, peasants found in these observances a measure of solace, as faith filled the spaces that grain could not. When harvests failed, the consequences spread like ripples across Europe. Chroniclers often wrote of years when rain drowned fields or frost struck early, leading to scarcity everywhere. These failures did not stay confined to one village. They disrupted trade, raised prices in markets, and starved entire regions. The famine of 1257 in England, or the crop failures noted in French chronicles, remind us how fragile the balance was, how easily nature overturned human labor. To live within the cycle of the agrarian year was to walk a narrow path between hope and despair. Each season carried both promise and threat, and peasants accepted this with a quiet endurance born of necessity. Their survival was written in the soil, the sky, and the harvest that followed. And though they had no choice but to follow this cycle, they also knew that every turn of the year was another chance, a fragile, fleeting gift. Among all the labors of the peasant, none carried more weight than the storing of grain. After the fields were cleared and the threshing done, sacks of rye, wheat, barley, or oats were set aside in pits dug into the ground or in rough barns of timber and thatch. These stores were the shield against hunger, the silent guardians of survival. Yet grain was fragile, always at risk from damp that turned kernels moldy or rodents that crept through cracks, leaving behind ruin in their wake. The methods of storage were simple but rarely secure. In some regions, peasants buried their grain in clay-lined pits, sealing them with straw and earth. Others kept it in lofts or wooden bins raised above the floor to protect from flooding. But no safeguard was perfect. Archaeologists have uncovered pits where dampness turned the contents into hardened lumps, unfit for bread. For families relying on every handful, Such loss was devastating, often spelling the difference between endurance and despair. Grain was not only nourishment, but also currency. With it, peasants paid their rents, their tithes, and their obligations to the lord of the manor. Often, a portion of the harvest went directly to the lord's granary, leaving peasants with reduced reserves. In years of poor harvest, this practice pressed hardest, forcing families to borrow or even buy back their own produce from the manorial stores at inflated prices. Documents from England and France record countless disputes arising from this bitter reality. Lords guarded communal granaries with vigilance. These tall, stone or timber structures symbolized power, for within them lay the security of the ruling household. During famine years, lords might choose to release portions to peasants, but this mercy was rare. More often, they sold at high profit, feeding markets instead of hungry villagers. It is little wonder that such granaries became both a source of resentment and, at times, targets in uprisings when hunger pushed people beyond endurance. Rats and mice played their own cruel part. Without the iron traps or poisons of later centuries, peasants relied on cats, dogs, or sheer vigilance to protect their stores. Chroniclers noted how entire reserves could vanish in weeks if rodents found their way in. Even when grain was safe from damp, the gnawing teeth of vermin could undo months of toil. Hunger was not always the work of distant weather. Sometimes it was born of tiny creatures unseen in the dark. The fragility of storage meant that grain rarely lasted unspoiled through the year. By late winter, the barrels and bins grew lighter, and the quality worsened. Kernels sprouted or soured, bread grew coarse, and meals turned bitter. Still, families clung to what remained, knowing that seed for the spring sowing had to be preserved. To eat too much of the store was to risk the next year's harvest, a cruel calculation between present hunger and future survival. Markets became the last resort. Peasants carried whatever surplus they had to sell, a goat, a skein of wool, or even their own labor, in order to buy grain when stores failed. Prices soared in winter, often doubling or tripling, leaving the poorest unable to compete. Urban merchants grew rich while villages grew thin, an imbalance recorded with frustration by clerks and priests alike. Hunger sharpened the lines between wealth and poverty, between privilege and hardship. To speak of grain stores is to speak of life itself in the Middle Ages. They were the fragile bridge between abundance and famine, a measure of time as much as of sustenance. Each kernel represented labor, faith, and hope for survival. And yet, the frailty of storage made every winter a gamble, a waiting game with hunger always close at hand. Those who endured carried within them the lesson that survival was never guaranteed, only fought for season by season. To understand the life of the medieval peasant, one must begin with bread. It was not simply food, but the very foundation of existence, filling most of the calories consumed each day. A good harvest meant loaves of wheat bread for the wealthier, while most families ate darker loaves of rye or barley. Bread was baked in village ovens or hearths, its smell a daily reminder of survival. Yet as winter deepened, the bread that reached the table changed, both in quality and in what it revealed about scarcity. In the early months after harvest, bread could still be made of finer grains. Families took pride in loaves that rose well, even if dense and heavy compared to what we know today. The flour was coarsely ground, bits of husk often mixed in, and each bite reminded the eater of the earth from which it came. But by late winter, when the granaries thinned, the quality of bread declined sharply. What once fed with dignity became rougher, darker, and far less nourishing. The ingenuity of survival meant bread was stretched with whatever was at hand. Chroniclers wrote of loaves padded with beans, peas, or chestnuts, ground finely to bulk out the dough. In times of greatest need, even acorns were dried, pounded, and mixed with grain to form something edible, though bitter on the tongue. Some regions knew of bark ground into meal, which gave bread a strange colour and harsh texture. To eat such loaves was to taste the edge of desperation itself. Baking was both a household duty and a communal one. Many villages maintained ovens shared among several families, each taking turns to bring their dough. Lords sometimes charged fees for this use, claiming rights over the oven as over the mill. For women, baking was a ritual of care, kneading dough with hope that it would rise enough to feed children another day. It was labor bound with prayer, for the loaf symbolized not only sustenance, but also divine blessing. Bread also carried weight beyond the table, woven into faith itself. The Eucharist turned bread into sacred presence, reminding peasants that their daily struggle mirrored spiritual truths. Hunger sharpened the meaning of such rituals. When bellies were empty, the promise of the bread of life brought consolation. In church and in hut alike, bread was seen as a gift from God, and to waste it was considered a sin. Yet not all loaves filled equally. Wealthier households, even among peasants, might still enjoy wheat bread deep into winter, while the poorest chewed crusts that crumbled with dryness. Records of disputes show how status was marked by the bread one ate, its whiteness or coarseness reflecting social standing. Hunger thus reinforced hierarchy, for even in scarcity, some endured it with more comfort than others. By spring, what bread remained often bore little resemblance to the loaves of autumn. Flour mixed with husks, weeds, or ground legumes made a heavy dough that sat uneasily in the stomach. Such bread did not nourish well, leaving the body weakened. Still, it was eaten with gratitude, for to have even a bitter loaf was better than to face the void of nothing at all. Hunger left no room for choice. The centrality of bread cannot be overstated. It was the first measure of a household's well-being, the daily reckoning of how long stores might last. Each loaf represented the fragility of survival, each crust a reminder of labor past and endurance ahead. When bread ran short or grew thin, the shadow of starvation loomed near. And so, in every cottage the peasant's hope rested on bread, humble, coarse, and sacred. When bread grew scarce, peasants turned to the pot simmering on the hearth, where grains stretched thin could still provide warmth and a measure of fullness. Porridge and gruel were the simplest of meals, made by boiling barley, oats, or millet in water, sometimes with a dash of milk or a handful of vegetables. These dishes lacked variety, but they offered something crucial, a way to make little stretch far. For many, the steaming bowl of pottage was the only barrier standing between the family and starvation. The preparation was humble, yet it carried its own rhythm. Families would leave a pot upon the fire day and night, adding scraps whenever they appeared, a bone for flavour, herbs gathered from hedgerows, or a shred of cabbage. In this way, the meal became a living thing, constantly renewed, evolving with whatever fortune or misfortune brought. The same broth might continue for weeks, sustaining through repetition what no harvest could provide in abundance. Chroniclers recorded with precision how monotonous such meals could become. To eat the same bowl of gruel day after day dulled both appetite and spirit, yet hunger left no room for complaint. Nutritionally, these dishes often failed to provide what the body required, leaving peasants weakened even as their bellies felt heavy. The thinness of porridge was a reminder of the thin line they walked, between life preserved and life diminished. In monasteries and manorial kitchens, similar dishes were prepared for servants and the poor. Distribution of pottage at monastery gates gave peasants something familiar, a continuation of what they ate at home. The consistency of the food made it accessible to children and the elderly, who often could not chew coarse bread. Such simple meals tied generations together, binding them to a cycle of survival that cared little for taste, but much for endurance. Peasants understood that even the poorest fare could be made palatable with care. Herbs like parsley, sorrel, or wild garlic found in the fields were thrown into pots, not to enrich, but to mask the blandness. In better years, pork fat or fish might lend depth, though these were luxuries most seldom enjoyed. The peasant cook became an artist of necessity, coaxing what little flavour could be found from a world of scarcity. The common pot also reflected the communal life of the household. Families huddled around it, dipping wooden spoons or crusts of bread into its contents. This act was more than nourishment. It was shared survival. In a single smoky room where livestock often slept nearby, the bubbling pot was both center and symbol, a hearth of resilience against the long winter night. It was not unusual for court records to mention thefts of barley or oats destined for porridge. Such thefts reveal the desperation of those who could not bear another empty evening. Grain meant bread in abundance, but in shortage, it meant the thin, watery gruel that still offered hope of living one more day. Hunger drove people not only to crime, but also to ingenuity, finding sustenance where none seemed to exist. Porridge and gruel may appear meager to us now, but in their time, they were lifelines. They carried no glory, no indulgence, yet they kept countless souls alive through seasons of cold and want. Each spoonful was a quiet triumph over despair, proof that even in the harshest winters, survival could be maintained by the simplest means. In those bowls of humble grain lay the perseverance of entire villages. Though meat rarely graced the table of a peasant, when it did, it was often in a form meant to endure the passing of months. Pork was the most common, for pigs could forage in woodlands and required little pasture. In the autumn, families slaughtered what they could not feed through winter, salting or smoking the flesh so it might last. Hanging from rafters or packed in barrels, these pieces became precious reserves, portioned out carefully when hunger sharpened its teeth in January and February. Fish played a different but no less vital role. Rivers, ponds, and coastal waters offered sustenance, yet it was the preserved herring that became essential in much of Europe. Barrels of salted or pickled herring, brought from the North Sea, reached markets hundreds of miles inland. The trade grew so vast that entire towns prospered on it, supplying not nobles alone, but also villages whose winters would have been even harsher without this staple. Herring became not merely food, but an artery of survival across Christendom. The hand of the church shaped these diets with force. Rules of fasting and abstinence, which forbade meat on Fridays and during Lent, turned fish into a necessity rather than a choice. Wealthy households built ponds to breed carp and pike, while peasants depended on rivers or purchased salted fish when they could afford it. In this way, faith intertwined with hunger, making preserved fish a constant presence even in the humblest hut. Salting, however, demanded resources beyond the reach of many. Salt itself was costly, drawn from marshes or traded across long routes. For peasants, a small quantity might be stretched to cure cuts of pork or bacon, giving flavor and longevity to their stores. Smokehouses, simple structures of timber and earth, were built where families had access to woodland fuel. The darkened meat that emerged was strong in taste, but reliable against decay, a trade-off peasants willingly accepted. The presence of meat or fish in winter was also a matter of hierarchy. Lords controlled forests and rivers, restricting hunting and fishing to their own use. Peasants caught poaching risked heavy fines or worse, yet hunger often pushed them into danger. Court records tell of men punished for taking deer or netting fish from forbidden waters, their need outweighing fear of retribution. The preservation of meat, then, was not just a culinary act, but a struggle against power. When famine struck, preserved stores became lifelines. A strip of salted pork boiled with cabbage, or a herring shared among a family, might mean the difference between life and death. Monasteries often distributed preserved fish during Lent or times of crisis, their barrels feeding lines of poor who waited at the gates. Though monotonous, such food carried hope, a reminder that sustenance could endure beyond the fleeting bounty of autumn. The taste of these preserved foods left its mark on memory. Strongly salted herring or heavily smoked bacon was harsh upon the tongue, yet in winter, no one complained. Children grew up with those flavors as reminders of cold nights and survival, and chroniclers recorded them as symbols of endurance. What we might find unpalatable was then received with gratitude, for it filled the emptiness that otherwise consumed. Preserved meats and fish reveal the delicate balance peasants lived with. They stretched the generosity of autumn into the harshest months, using craft and necessity to protect against famine. In the smoke of their hearths and the brine of their barrels lay ingenuity born of hardship. These humble stores, though never abundant, carried entire families across the thin ice of winter into the promise of spring. When the stores grew thin and the bread shrank to crumbs, peasants turned to the frozen earth and bare woodlands in search of whatever could be found. Even under snow, roots lay hidden, and sharp eyes could uncover nourishment where none seemed possible. Women and children gathered dried berries left from autumn, nuts forgotten by squirrels, and mushrooms stored from earlier months. These were small treasures, never enough to fill the belly, but enough to delay despair. Foraging was both a skill and a necessity, honed by generations who knew every inch of their surroundings. Woodlands and commons became lifelines, yet they were not freely open to all. Manorial charters and village bylaws carefully regulated who could gather wood, hunt small animals, or collect acorns. Disputes arose often for what seemed like a handful of firewood or a basket of nuts to one family was trespass to another. Hunger sharpened tempers, and court rolls from across Europe tell of quarrels that ended in fines or punishments. Foraging thus balanced between survival and risk, a delicate walk along the edge of law. Even in winter, some plants offered hope. Nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic, once dried and stored, could flavor the endless broths simmering in peasant huts. Roots, such as parsnips or wild carrots, pulled from beneath the frost, provided rare bursts of nutrition. These foods lacked the bulk of bread or porridge, but carried vital minerals that kept sickness at bay. They were reminders that the earth, though harsh, still gave fragments of life to those who sought it with patience. Hedgerows, too, held their gifts. Hawthorn berries, though bitter, could be eaten in small quantities, while rose hips offered a tart relief against the monotony of winter meals. Children learned to recognize these plants early, trained by necessity to distinguish what nourished from what poisoned. Knowledge of the land was inherited like an heirloom, passed down in stories and practice, for in winter, ignorance could be fatal. Fish traps in streams or snares set for rabbits sometimes offered additional reward, yet these pursuits were fraught with danger, for lords claimed rights over hunting and fishing. Still, desperation often outweighed fear. Chronicles speak of men whipped or fined for taking a rabbit from the lord's forest, their crime driven not by greed, but by hunger. To forage was not only to seek food, but also to test the boundaries of power. Gathering fuel for warmth was bound to this same struggle. Peasants collected brushwood, peat, or dried dung to keep their hearths alive. Without such foraging, the bitter nights would have frozen them as surely as hunger. Every journey into the woods was thus a quest for both flame and food, a reminder that survival meant using every corner of the natural world. Communal life softened these hardships at times. Villagers might go together into the forests, sharing the labor and the risk, dividing what they found. Such cooperation built bonds of trust, but it could also strain them when scarcity turned neighbors into rivals. Still, in the harshest winters, the act of foraging side by side carried not only sustenance, but solidarity. The memory of foraging lingers in the stories left behind. It was not abundance, but scraps that marked those winters. Scraps gathered by hands numb with cold, by eyes trained to see what others overlooked. Through nuts, roots, and berries, peasants stretched existence one day further, reminding themselves that even the stingiest season could not take away the will to endure. In the face of hunger, it was often the humblest of crops that gave peasants the strength to carry on. Turnips, parsnips, and cabbages were not delicacies, nor were they admired by the wealthy, yet they sustained countless families through the bitter months. Grown in small garden plots beside cottages, these hardy plants could be harvested late into the season or stored underground. They endured frost better than most grains, and their resilience in the soil made them dependable when all else failed. Turnips were particularly valued for their versatility. They could be eaten raw, boiled into stews, or even fed to livestock when harvests permitted. Their earthy taste became a familiar companion through winter, filling bowls when bread was scarce. Archaeological remains confirm their widespread presence in rural diets, showing how central they were to subsistence farming. Though rarely praised in chronicles, the turnip was a silent saviour of the poor. Cabbages, too, became essential. Their thick leaves resisted the cold and, when buried in pits lined with straw, could last for months. Some families dug cellars specifically for their storage, layering soil and straw to keep them edible. While monotonous, cabbage was a dependable source of bulk in meals, finding its way into endless pots of pottage. Monks and physicians even praised it for its medicinal qualities, a reminder that food was both sustenance and remedy. Parsnips and carrots added variety, their sweetness a welcome relief from bitterness. These roots thrived in the damp soils of northern Europe and could be lifted from the earth even in the heart of winter. Their nutritional value helped prevent disease, though few peasants thought in such terms. They were valued simply because they were there, reliable in a world where so much else could be taken away by frost or flood. Storage techniques were simple but effective. Vegetables were buried in clamps, earthen pits lined with straw and covered to keep out frost. Families returned to these caches throughout the winter, digging carefully to retrieve what they needed. Such methods required foresight and labour, but without them, starvation would have come sooner. The pit became as important as the granary, a second line of defence against the cold season. These vegetables also reflected the divide between classes. While peasants depended on them daily, nobles dismissed them as coarse food, preferring meat, wheat bread, and imported spices. Yet in times of famine, even lords turned to roots and cabbages, a humbling equalizer. Accounts from the Great Famine reveal that when hunger struck deeply enough, all distinctions fell away, and the same earthy fare fed both hut and hall. The cultivation of such crops was woven into the rhythm of village life. Women often tended these gardens, ensuring that something edible grew close to the home. Children were taught to weed and harvest, their small hands helping to pull roots from the ground. In this way, survival rested not only on the open fields, but also on these modest garden plots, which brought food within reach when granaries failed. Turnips, cabbages, and hardy vegetables rarely entered the songs of the troubadours or the chronicles of kings. Yet they were the quiet backbone of endurance, the reason many poor families managed to outlast the cruelest winters. In their humble forms, they carried the weight of survival, proving that greatness is sometimes found not in luxury, but in persistence beneath the frozen soil. In the colder months, the sound of milk pails being filled grew rare, for the rhythm of livestock followed nature's course. Cows calved less in winter, and the shortage of fodder meant their bodies grew thin, producing little milk. What was plentiful in summer, cream, butter, and cheese, dwindled steadily by December. Families relied on what they had managed to preserve, but by midwinter, these stores often shrank to nothing, leaving only memory of the richness they once provided. Cheese was the most reliable way to carry dairy into the harsh season. In the warmer months, milk was curdled and pressed into hard wheels that could endure for months if kept dry and cool. These wheels were cut sparingly through the winter, each slice a guarded treasure. Butter, though loved, did not last so long, and without salt to preserve it, quickly turned rancid. Thus cheese became the peasant's winter companion, though even that supply was fragile. Archaeological residue on pottery reveals traces of dairy fat, proof that even the poorest families consumed milk products when possible. Yet scarcity made them careful stewards of what they had. A small piece of cheese grated into pottage or laid upon coarse bread transformed the meal, giving not only nourishment but also a sense of dignity. Such moments reminded the hungry that the earth once gave more generously, even if the present withheld. Children felt the absence most sharply. In summer, milk provided them with strength, but in winter they grew gaunt without it. Mothers sometimes watered down what little milk they had, stretching it into thin portions for the youngest. Parish records often show higher infant mortality in these lean months, a sorrow tied not only to hunger in general, but to the lack of nourishing milk that had once sustained growth. The church's fasts added another layer of complexity. On days when meat was forbidden, dairy too was often restricted, leading families to turn back once again to bread, vegetables, or fish. While nobles might find substitutes through imported oils or almonds, peasants had no such luxury. The rhythm of fasting overlapped with the rhythm of scarcity, intensifying the hardship rather than softening it. For those who could not keep animals of their own, dependence on neighbors or markets was unavoidable. A cup of milk or a wedge of cheese could only be obtained through trade, often at prices too high in winter. The imbalance between those who owned cows and those who did not created quiet tensions, though necessity sometimes led to sharing, when bonds of kinship held strong. Still, many simply went without. The memory of dairy scarcity shaped culture as well. Songs and sayings praised the summer's butter or the richness of cream, contrasting them with the meager bowls of winter. To taste fresh milk in spring after months of absence was to feel reborn, a reminder that the world still renewed itself. In such small joys, peasants found encouragement to endure the bleakest weeks. Though milk, butter and cheese seldom defined wealth in the same way as grain or livestock, their absence in winter revealed the fragility of peasant life. They were not luxuries, but fleeting comforts, treasured when they appeared and mourned when they were gone. In the scarcity of dairy, one sees the deeper rhythm of survival, a cycle of plenty and want, endured with patience and hope for renewal when spring returned. In villages where water often carried sickness, ale and beer became more than indulgence. They were daily necessities. Brewing turned grain into liquid sustenance, offering both calories and safety from disease. Even the youngest drank it, for weak, small beer contained little alcohol, but enough purity to be trusted. In this way, ale flowed through every season, but its presence in winter carried particular weight, filling bellies when food was scarce and warming spirits against the cold. The process itself was woven into household life. Women, known as alewives, brewed in small batches, using barley or oats when available. Their work filled cottages with the smell of malt, smoke, and fermenting yeast. Brewing in winter meant competing with cold temperatures that slowed fermentation, yet necessity pushed families to attempt it whenever they had grain to spare. The brew was rarely strong, but it sustained, turning grain into a liquid form that could be shared. Ale carried nourishment in ways beyond hydration. It provided vital energy, with grains releasing their strength into the drink. For labourers spending long days in frozen fields, or repairing tools by dim firelight, a cup of ale was as much fuel as bread. Though thin and often sour, it restored vigour and gave peasants a sense of comfort in their hardship. To drink together also meant to endure together, for every shared cup was an act of solidarity. Larger households or manors brewed on greater scales, storing barrels for months at a time. These stores served both their own tables and the village, as peasants might buy or receive ale when their own brewing failed. Fees for brewing rights were sometimes charged by lords, just as with ovens and mills, binding even the act of making drink to obligations. Records show fines for those who brewed without permission, proof that even in this simplest of crafts, control and power loomed. Markets reflected this dependence clearly. Ale was sold in towns and villages alike, measured by the jug or pot, its price rising in lean years when grain was scarce. Brewers could profit well in such times, but accusations of watering down or cheating customers filled local court rolls. Trust was as important as skill, for in every community, people remembered who brewed fairly and who sought to profit from hunger. The presence of ale was also marked in the church calendar. Fasting rules that forbade meat and dairy did not forbid ale, making it one of the few steady comforts during holy seasons. Monasteries brewed with greater skill, producing stronger beers that nourished their communities and sometimes the poor at their gates. Thus, beer was bound not only to sustenance but also to faith, a constant presence in both sacred and ordinary life. Even children grew up with the taste, their earliest memories shaped by the clay cups passed around the family hearth. The drink tied generations together, its brewing knowledge handed down as carefully as seed for the fields. To lack ale in winter was a bitter blow, for it meant water alone, often unsafe and thin. Survival was never just about eating. It was also about what one could safely drink. Ale and beer may seem humble, yet in truth they were pillars of endurance. They offered health where water threatened, strength where bread waned, and fellowship where cold sought to isolate. In every village, through every winter, the froth in a cup reflected centuries of resilience. In the murk of that simple brew lay a quiet defiance, a daily answer to hunger and despair. In the medieval village, hunger was not only the work of barren fields or harsh winters, but also of obligations that pressed upon every household. No matter how meagre the harvest, peasants owed rents to their lords, dues for the land they tilled, and tithes to the church. These payments were not suspended in famine. They arrived like clockwork, demanded in grain, labor, or coin. For many families, it meant surrendering part of their stores even when their children cried with hunger. Survival was measured not only in food, but in what remained after obligations were met. The tithe was particularly heavy. 1/10 of all produce was owed to the parish, a duty both spiritual and enforced. Clergy argued it was God's right, a sacred portion to support the church and its poor. Yet records show that peasants often resented this demand, especially when their own tables lay bare. To give from scarcity bred bitterness, though faith tempered rebellion. Many complied out of fear not only of punishment but of divine wrath, for withholding tithes was preached as a sin against heaven itself. Manorial records reveal another layer of burden. Lords required labour on their own lands, even in winter when peasants needed every moment to care for their families. Obligations to repair roads, cut wood, or transport goods consumed time that might otherwise have been spent seeking food. Hunger made such duties heavier, for the weak struggled to carry loads or dig frozen ground. Yet failure to appear brought fines, adding debt to starvation. It was a cycle that crushed the poorest beneath its weight. Even tools of survival were taxed. The mill, where grain was ground into flour, often belonged to the lord, who took a portion of every sack as payment. Likewise, the communal oven demanded a fee for baking. These small but constant deductions meant that by the time bread reached the table, much of the harvest had already passed into other hands. Hunger, then, was not only the absence of food, but also the result of structures that claimed it first. In times of famine, peasants sometimes petitioned for relief, yet mercy was uneven. A lord might forgive part of a rent to maintain peace, but more often obligations remained, enforced by stewards and courts. The balance of power leaned heavily against those who had no voice but their. It is little wonder that resentment simmered, for hunger sharpened awareness of injustice, even if open defiance was rare. The church's role was more complex. While tithes drained, monasteries sometimes distributed food to the starving. Parish priests urged patience and faith, reminding villagers that obedience was a path to salvation. Yet such comfort did not always ease the pain of empty bellies. Documents from the period show fines imposed on peasants who withheld tithes in desperation, proof that hunger offered no shield from the law. These obligations shaped the choices families made. To pay the rent, a cow might be sold, leaving less milk for the children. To give grain to the tithe, a household might stretch bread thinner, living on gruel for weeks. Every duty paid was a sacrifice, every sacrifice a gamble with survival. What endured was not only hunger, but also the quiet endurance of those who carried burdens without hope of relief. The memory of these obligations lingers in the records left behind, rolls of dues, fines, and payments written with cold precision. They show a world where even in famine, duty came first, and where peasants bore the double weight of nature's cruelty and human demand. In this harsh balance, resilience was forged, though often at the cost of lives lost to a system that demanded obedience before sustenance. Amidst the hardship of barren winters, there were places where the hungry could find a measure of relief. Monasteries, bound by vows of charity, opened their gates to those who queued in the cold, hoping for bread or a bowl of steaming pottage. Chronicles from Cluny, York, and other centres of devotion record how monks distributed food in organised fashion, sometimes saving whole villages from collapse. For peasants whose larders stood empty, the monastery door became a beacon of survival, both spiritual and physical. These acts of giving were not without structure. Monastic kitchens worked daily, preparing large cauldrons of soup thickened with grains and vegetables from their own gardens. Bread was baked in quantities far greater than any single household could manage. The poor assembled at set times, often after prayers, to receive their portion. It was meagre, yet it meant one more day endured, one more night passed without the full weight of hunger pressing upon them. The generosity had roots in faith as much as necessity. Monks saw their work as service to Christ himself, feeding the hungry as holy duty. This belief gave the poor not only food, but also a sense of dignity, for they were reminded that their suffering was not unseen by heaven. Yet records also show that the distribution of alms was often tied to religious practice, with prayers expected in return, binding charity and devotion together. Still, the reach of monastic charity was uneven. Wealthy abbeys could afford to give generously, while smaller houses offered little beyond what their own meagre stores allowed. In years of widespread famine, even monasteries strained under demand, and what they provided could not match the scale of need. Desperation sometimes led to unrest at their gates, crowds pressing too closely, their hunger stronger than reverence. For many peasants, these moments of relief carved deep memories. To taste bread baked from flour they could never afford, or to drink ale brewed by monks' skilled hands, was to glimpse abundance otherwise denied. These meals were not feasts, yet they stood in contrast to the bitter loaves and thin gruel of home. In receiving charity, peasants touched a world that seemed beyond their reach, even if only for a moment. Monasteries also became centres of redistribution. Nobles and landholders sometimes gave alms through them, seeking both to ease unrest and to secure salvation for their souls. Grain collected as tithe might pass through monastic hands before reaching the poor, transforming obligation into grace. In this way, monasteries stood as intermediaries between power and poverty, softening, if never erasing, the sharp edges of feudal demands. The records of these charitable acts remind us that survival was not purely an individual struggle. It was tied to networks of faith, authority, and tradition. Even in the harshest winters, the act of giving linked the fate of monks and peasants together. Hunger humbled all, but charity bound them in shared humanity, however unequal their stations remained. Though such aid rarely ended famine, it offered a thread of hope. The sound of monastery bells calling the poor to the gate echoed through villages, as a reminder that endurance was possible. In those small portions, handed out with prayers, lay more than food. There was reassurance that in a world ruled by scarcity, compassion still had its place. Surviving the cold was as urgent as finding food, for hunger weakened the body, but frost could claim it swiftly. Peasants dressed themselves in layers of wool, spun and woven within their own households. A tunic formed the base, often coarse and heavy, while cloaks and mantles added protection against the biting wind. Those who could afford it lined garments with fur from rabbits or sheep, though most relied on simple wool, patched and worn year after year. Warmth was never taken for granted. It was stitched into every seam. Wool was the lifeblood of winter clothing. Sheep grazed on common pastures, their fleece sheared in summer and spun during long evenings. Women transformed it into yarn, weaving or knitting garments that clothed entire families. The quality varied, some rough, some softer, but every piece carried the labor of hands that worked through seasons. Even the poorest households sought scraps of wool, for without it, exposure to the cold could mean illness or death. Shoes and boots were another matter. Leather was scarce and costly. So many walked with worn footwear, repaired countless times with patches or scraps. In snow and mud, feet grew damp, bringing chilblains and frostbite. Straw was sometimes stuffed inside shoes to keep out the cold, while wealthier peasants might line them with felt. The feet, always closest to the frozen ground, reminded every soul of the harshness of the season. Fuel for fires was as vital as clothing, yet it was often in short supply. Firewood, controlled by lords, could be scarce or forbidden to peasants who lacked rights of collection. Instead, many burned peat, brushwood, or dried dung, each producing more smoke than heat. Hearths filled homes with acrid air, eyes stinging as families huddled close to catch what warmth they could. The fire was never strong enough, but without it, nights became unbearable. Inside the small huts, warmth was conserved in other ways. Families crowded together in a single room, often sharing space with livestock. The body heat of animals, cows, goats, or pigs, added a precious degree to the chill air. Smoke from the hearth clung to rafters, seeping into clothes and hair, a constant companion through the season. What we might now see as hardship was then necessity, for survival demanded closeness. Cloaks and hoods provided essential protection outdoors. Travel in winter was dangerous, but when unavoidable, men and women wrapped themselves tightly in woolen garments that shielded against wind and sleet. Hoods framed faces, leaving only eyes exposed, while gloves or mittens, often simple scraps tied together, kept hands from stiffening. To be caught unprepared in the elements could be fatal, so every layer was a safeguard. The contrast between rich and poor was never more visible than in winter garments. Nobles adorned themselves in furs from fox, beaver, or sable, garments of beauty as well as function. Peasants, by comparison, wore patched cloaks that bore the marks of long service. Yet both sought the same end: endurance against the cold. The elegance of fur and the roughness of wool alike testified to the season's unyielding demand. Clothing and warmth were silent protectors, often overlooked beside food, but no less crucial. Each cloak, each fire, each shared breath within a smoky hut formed a shield against the merciless cold. The memory of winter lives not only in hunger, but also in the struggle to stay warm, a struggle met with patience, labor, and the ingenuity of those who refused to yield to frost. The huts of the peasantry offered little refuge from the severity of winter. Built of wattle and daub, with walls of woven branches plastered in mud and dung, these dwellings were fragile barriers against the cold. Thatched roofs leaked when snow melted, and drafts slipped easily through cracks. Inside, smoke from the hearth hung thick, for chimneys were rare, and the fire burned on a simple stone hearth in the center of the floor. Warmth was elusive, but necessity kept families within these humble shelters. Space was meager, often just a single room. Families ate, worked, and slept in the same place, pressed tightly together to preserve heat. Livestock shared the space, tethered in corners or behind partitions, their breath adding warmth and their bodies providing a sense of security. Children nestled beside animals as often as they did their parents. Archaeological digs confirm the compact nature of these homes, with footprints showing cramped arrangements designed to conserve every degree of heat. Floors were of earth, sometimes covered in rushes or straw to soften the ground. Yet dampness rose from below, and cold seeped into bones through the night. The rushes had to be changed often, for they collected dirt, refuse, and vermin, filling the air with staleness. Still, they were necessary, for without them bare ground would freeze the feet and deepen the misery of winter living. The line between shelter and exposure was thin. Light was scarce within these huts. Small windows, when they existed at all, were covered with oiled cloth or thin parchment rather than glass. During the short days of winter, families worked by the flicker of firelight or tallow candles when they could be afforded. Shadows filled the corners, and the smoke-laden air made the room seem darker still. Life indoors was not a comfort, but a confinement endured. Furnishings were minimal: a few stools, rough tables, and straw-filled mattresses. Wooden chests served as both storage and seating. Beds were shared by several members of the family, lying side by side beneath woolen blankets or patched quilts. The closeness of bodies provided more warmth than the fire could give, though illness spread swiftly in such conditions. Comfort was measured not in luxury, but in the ability to withstand. The huts also revealed the dependence of peasants on natural materials. Timber from nearby woods, clay dug from the soil, straw from their own harvests, all were shaped into dwellings that could be repaired each year. Yet storms and heavy snow often damaged roofs or collapsed walls, leaving families scrambling to mend their homes in the midst of hardship. Survival was not only about storing food, but also about keeping the roof upright. For many, the home was both prison and sanctuary. Its walls trapped smoke and stench, yet without them, exposure to wind and snow would quickly bring death. Neighbors sometimes gathered to help patch roofs or repair fences, knowing that in winter, one family's weakness could threaten the whole village. The resilience of the community was reflected in the survival of these small huts, standing defiantly against the season's cruelty. Though meager, these dwellings carried the essence of peasant life: simplicity, endurance, and adaptation. They were not built for beauty or for comfort, but for survival. To step inside was to enter a space shaped by necessity, where every corner testified to the struggle against hunger and cold. In those smoky, crowded rooms, peasants bore the weight of winter together. Their homes, fragile shelters of endurance in a relentless world. The toll of winter hunger did not end with empty stomachs. It weakened the body until illness found easy purchase. Malnutrition stripped away strength, leaving peasants vulnerable to ailments that in better seasons might have been endured. Chroniclers observed how disease often followed famine, with waves of dysentery and influenza sweeping through villages. In the silence of snowbound fields, the sounds of coughing and wailing filled smoky huts, testifying to the close bond between hunger and sickness. Weakened immune systems meant that even minor illnesses became deadly. Children with bellies swollen from lack of nutrients succumbed quickly to fevers, while the elderly faded when they could no longer fight infection. Parish records reveal spikes in burials during late winter, a grim pattern repeating year after year. The hunger that hollowed the body also hollowed the defenses, and the result was often death before spring's first thaw. The crowded homes only deepened the crisis. Families huddled together for warmth, livestock sharing the same space, and smoke clogging the air. Disease spread swiftly in such close quarters, passed from hand to hand, cough to cough. Clean water was scarce, and with immune systems weakened, the smallest contamination could unleash dysentery. The very act of survival, crowding close against the cold, invited sickness into the heart of every home. Monks and physicians of the time noted the connections, though their remedies were limited. Herbs such as sage or garlic were prescribed, and prayers were offered for divine healing. Yet without food to restore strength, such treatments brought little relief. A starving body could not recover, and so illness continued its slow harvest, taking those already marked by hunger. Faith provided comfort, but comfort did not always save lives. Famine years brought the most devastation. When harvests failed, the combination of starvation and disease became overwhelming. Chronicles tell of villages where half the population perished, not always from hunger itself, but from the fevers that followed. To live through such times was to carry scars, not only in the body, but in memory. Survivors bore witness to how quickly hunger invited death through sickness. Even when food returned with spring, the damage lingered. Children stunted by malnutrition often remained frail, their growth forever slowed. Adults who endured illness carried weakness into the seasons ahead. Villages rebuilt, but the losses left gaps in families and communities that could not easily be filled. Hunger and disease were not fleeting afflictions. They reshaped the course of lives long after the winter ended. Communities sought solace in faith, interpreting plague and famine as divine chastisement. Processions and fasts were called, seeking mercy from heaven. Yet within this belief lay a kind of resilience. If suffering came from God, then endurance carried meaning. Though illness claimed many, those who remained clung to the hope that their patience and devotion would one day bring relief. The bond between hunger and disease shaped the rhythm of medieval life. They were twin spectres of winter, each sharpening the other's edge. To survive both was an act of endurance, a quiet triumph that rarely made its way into chronicles, yet lived on in every villager who carried their frailty into spring. In this way, the story of survival was written not only in fields and granaries, but also in the frail bodies that endured against all odds. There are years remembered not for their ordinary hardship, but for catastrophe that swept across nations, and the years 1315 to 1317 were among the darkest in medieval memory. Relentless rains drenched fields, drowning seeds and rotting grain before it ripened. Summer skies stayed grey, and cold winds struck early, turning harvests to ruin. What should have been a cycle of survival collapsed entirely, leaving people across northern Europe in the grip of hunger, unlike any before. The famine did not strike a village or two. It consumed whole regions. Chronicles from England, France, the Low Countries, and Germany echo the same despair. Grain yields fell sharply, and livestock perished when fields turned to swamps. Hay rotted where it lay, leaving cattle with no fodder for winter. Sheep and oxen weakened, their carcasses dotting the landscape, a silent testimony to the collapse of the agrarian system. With animals gone and fields ruined, the very foundations of peasant survival crumbled in only a few seasons. The hunger that followed was swift and merciless. Bread disappeared from tables, replaced by coarse substitutes barely edible. Prices soared beyond reach. In some towns, grain cost triple its usual amount. Poor families, unable to pay, turned to roots, weeds, and famine foods that offered little more than the illusion of sustenance. Mortality rose sharply, and in many places, the dead outnumbered the living who could bury them. Parish registers filled with names erased by the famine's shadow. The desperation bred acts that horrified even the hardened chroniclers of the age. Reports tell of people eating the flesh of horses and dogs when no other food could be found. In the darkest accounts, whispers of cannibalism surfaced, though such acts carried shame and silence. These stories, though difficult to confirm, reflect the extremity of the suffering, where the ordinary bounds of human behavior collapsed under the weight of starvation. Urban centers fared little better than villages. Cities, dependent on trade, saw grain caravans delayed or halted by flooded roads and ruined supplies. Riots erupted in market squares when food was withheld or sold at impossible prices. Lords and merchants hoarded what they could, but even wealth offered limited refuge when the fields gave nothing. The famine revealed how fragile the connection between countryside and city truly was. The church responded with processions, fasts and prayers, interpreting the disaster as divine punishment for sin. Bells tolled across Christendom, calling communities to repentance, yet the rains did not cease. For peasants, faith remained a lifeline, though it was tested harshly. Many clung to the hope that their endurance would be rewarded, that suffering had meaning beyond the misery it brought. In this way, belief itself became a form of survival. The famine's devastation reached beyond immediate hunger. Birth rates fell, populations declined, and villages emptied. Survivors carried lasting scars, physical, emotional, and cultural. Songs, stories, and chronicles written decades later still spoke of those years with dread, calling them the Great Hunger. It was remembered not only for its deaths, but for the way it revealed human fragility against the might of nature. By 1318, the skies cleared and harvests slowly returned, but the memory endured long after. The Great Famine stood as a warning etched into history, that even the most familiar cycle of sowing and reaping could be undone by forces beyond control. For those who lived through it, survival was not triumph, but endurance, a quiet defiance against despair that echoed through generations. When fields yielded little and stores ran thin, villagers turned to the market square, the beating heart of medieval commerce. Weekly gatherings brought peasants, merchants, and craftsmen together, exchanging goods that meant the difference between survival and despair. Grain, meat, fish, and cloth filled the stalls, though in winter the supplies were meagre and the prices steep. For the poor, the market was both a lifeline and a place of bitter disappointment, for what they needed most often lay beyond their reach. The role of these markets extended beyond food alone. Families carried surplus wool, eggs, or tools to sell, hoping to gather enough coin to buy a sack of barley or rye. Women frequently played central roles in this trade, managing the sale of produce or small crafts. A few coins might secure a meal for several days, though profits were thin and easily swallowed by inflated winter prices. Trade was not abundance but negotiation, a constant weighing of need against possibility. In times of plenty, markets were lively, filled with chatter, bargaining, and laughter. Yet in famine years, they grew tense, the stalls bare, and the voices sharp. Accounts from chroniclers describe crowds pressing around grain sellers, their desperation plain. The wealthy merchants and landlords who controlled supplies often profited during these shortages, selling at high prices while the poor grew gaunt. Hunger sharpened the sense of inequality, revealing how survival depended as much on access as on effort. Urban centers benefited most from this trade. Towns drew in grain from surrounding villages, sometimes leaving rural people with little. The city gates welcomed carts of rye or wheat, yet peasants often found themselves excluded by cost. The contrast between urban abundance and rural hunger fueled resentment, and disputes between town and country were not uncommon. Hunger revealed the fragile balance between these two worlds. Markets also served as places of regulation. Authorities attempted to fix prices or punish hoarders, though enforcement was uneven. Grain measures were inspected, but fraud remained common, and court records show frequent cases of sellers accused of cheating buyers. Trust was fragile, for in winter every kernel mattered, and deception could cost a family dearly. Justice was sought, but hunger often left little time to wait for verdicts. Long-distance trade shaped survival too. Salted fish from the North Sea, wine from France, or spices from distant lands all passed through these markets, though only the wealthier could afford them. For peasants, such goods were a distant dream, reminders of the great gulf that divided their world from that of the nobility. Still, the presence of these luxuries in the same stalls where peasants begged for barley made the contrasts of society visible in stark relief. Winter scarcity magnified these tensions. The same sack of grain that fed a noble household for a week could mean a month's survival for a peasant family, yet the price placed it firmly out of reach. Hunger became entwined with commerce, each transaction carrying the weight of life or death. Markets did not create famine, but they exposed its sharpest edges, turning need into currency. Despite hardship, peasants returned week after week, for the market was indispensable. It was the place where food, news, and hope converged, even when both prices and prospects were grim. Each journey to the square was an act of endurance, a step into the uncertain balance of survival shaped by trade. In those gatherings, the struggle of winter hunger was played out in every bargain and every coin exchanged. The grain that fed entire villages rarely moved directly from field to loaf. It passed first through spaces of control, communal mills and granaries, where power revealed itself in every toll and measure. Lords owned most mills, compelling peasants to grind their grain there rather than by hand. A portion of each sack was claimed as payment, a burden deeply resented yet unavoidable. This obligation turned even the act of making bread into a reminder of dependence, for no household could escape the miller's toll. Granaries, too, stood as symbols of both security and inequality. Stone or timber structures rose near manor houses or village centres, their contents guarded by stewards. They stored harvests for lords and monasteries, often full even when peasant households went hungry. During lean years, grain from these reserves might be released, but rarely as charity. More often, it was sold at high prices, feeding markets and coffers, while villages struggled to survive. Hunger deepened when the doors of these storerooms remained closed. The mill itself was a place of daily gathering. Peasants queued with sacks upon their shoulders, waiting for their turn at the grinding stone. The sound of water wheels or creaking wooden gears filled the air, echoing through valleys. Yet alongside this rhythm came resentment, for every family watched part of its flour vanish into the miller's share. Accusations of dishonesty were common, with millers suspected of taking more than their due. Court records are filled with disputes born of hunger sharpened by mistrust. Communal storage also reflected the fragility of preservation. Grain held in barns or pits could spoil with dampness or be eaten by vermin, wasting months of labour. Lords could afford stone-built granaries with better protection, while peasants relied on rougher methods. When shortages struck, the contrast was painfully visible. Noble stores remained intact, while peasant pits failed, dividing endurance along lines of wealth. The granary was thus more than storage. It was a mirror of social order. In times of famine, communal systems became battlegrounds. Hungry peasants sometimes stormed mills or granaries, demanding fairer access to food. Chroniclers note such moments of desperation, when obedience gave way to rebellion. These acts were not born of greed, but of survival, for no one watched their children starve quietly when grain lay locked away in sight. The millstone, then, was not only a tool of sustenance, but also a spark of unrest. The reliance on these institutions tied villages together. No household could be entirely independent. Each needed the grinding of the mill. Each faced the dues that came with it. This shared dependence fostered both solidarity and grievance, for peasants endured the same burdens, yet also competed for limited grain. The communal spaces reflected the interwoven nature of their lives, where no one could separate their survival from that of their neighbours. Monasteries offered a different model, sometimes running mills or granaries that served both their own needs and those of surrounding villages. Some were fairer in practice, distributing food in hard times, while others imitated the strictness of secular lords. Records from abbeys show careful accounting, proving how closely grain was guarded, even when faith encouraged generosity. Hunger was thus filtered through institutions of both secular and sacred power. Communal storage and milling reveal how survival in winter was never just about the harvest. It was about who controlled the grain, how it was measured, and what portion could be claimed by those at the bottom. The wheel turned, the stones ground, and life continued. But beneath it all lay the tension between necessity and control, a tension that defined the very rhythm of medieval existence. Through the harshest winters, it was often women who carried the weight of keeping households alive. Their labour stretched far beyond the hearth, weaving together the threads of sustenance when resources grew scarce. They brewed ale, tended gardens, and foraged in woods and fields, their knowledge of herbs and wild foods proving invaluable. In court records, their names appear frequently, not for wealth or power, but for acts of resilience, sometimes praised, sometimes punished, always central to endurance. Brewing was one of their most constant duties. Women mastered the craft of turning barley into ale, providing nourishment and safe drink for families and neighbours. In lean months, their skill in stretching grain into liquid sustenance meant survival. They sold small surpluses at markets, their earnings vital for purchasing bread or salt. These alewives appear in manorial roles, evidence of women's economic presence even within a society that often confined them to the home. Preserving food was another task largely entrusted to them. During autumn, women salted meat, dried herbs, and stored vegetables in pits or cellars, preparing for the inevitable hunger of winter. Their foresight determined whether supplies lasted until spring. Without such labor, the cold months would have been far more merciless. It was a silent power, one rarely acknowledged in chronicles, but written into the survival of every household. Foraging demanded equal skill. Women gathered nuts, berries, roots, and mushrooms. Knowledge passed through generations of mothers to daughters. They knew which plants healed and which poisoned, which roots could fill the pot without harm. In desperate times, such wisdom stood between life and death. Court rolls tell of women accused of stealing firewood or grain, revealing how necessity pushed them into conflict with manorial laws. Their risks were taken not for themselves, but for those waiting at home. Spinning and weaving also played their part in winter survival. With wool from village sheep, women produced clothing and blankets that guarded against the cold. Long nights were filled with the whir of spinning wheels or the rhythm of needles, turning fleece into protection. In this way, they clothed not only their families, but sometimes neighbors, bartering garments for food or favors. Warmth, like bread, was shaped by women's hands. Mothers bore the heaviest burden in times of famine. They rationed meals, often going without so their children could eat. Parish records reveal the sorrow of high child mortality in winters of hunger, yet also testify to the endurance of those who managed to carry their families through. Chroniclers may have overlooked their daily sacrifices, but the survival of villages rested quietly on their choices. Women also played roles in community support. They joined together in tasks such as baking in communal ovens or sharing milk and cheese when supplies ran thin. Bonds between neighbors often depended on the cooperation of women, who understood that survival was rarely an individual achievement. Their acts of charity, though small, echoed through households, softening the sharpness of hunger. The endurance of peasant life cannot be told without acknowledging their part. Women carried the knowledge of land, food, and craft in ways that kept whole families alive when the earth seemed barren. Their contributions may not fill the chronicles of kings, yet they are inscribed in the quiet triumph of survival itself. In their hands lay the resilience of winter, a legacy as vital as any battle or decree. In the long winters, when hunger settled heavily upon the land, it was the youngest and the oldest who bore the deepest suffering. Children, with bodies still fragile, grew gaunt when milk vanished and bread thinned. Parish registers reveal that infant mortality rose steeply in famine years, their small frames unable to withstand prolonged scarcity. The elderly, too, weakened quickly, for age left them vulnerable to cold and disease when strength was most needed. Families faced cruel choices, balancing rations with a painful awareness of who might endure. The cries of children echoed through huts, thin and restless from empty bellies. Mothers stretched what food they had, adding more water to porridge or breaking loaves into smaller pieces. Yet the nourishment was seldom enough. In some regions, the strongest children were favored, given larger portions to ensure at least one survived. It was a harsh arithmetic, driven not by cruelty, but by necessity, an unspoken sorrow that lingered in memory long after spring returned. Elders often endured in silence, eating less so their grandchildren might eat more. Their wisdom guided families, reminding them of past famines and the strategies that once brought survival. Yet sacrifice came at a cost, and many slipped away quietly in the depths of winter. Archaeological evidence shows skeletal remains marked by malnutrition among older adults, proof that their resilience, though great, could not always carry them through. Despite hardship, both children and the elderly were central to the rhythm of village life. The young carried hope, the possibility of a future that stretched beyond hunger. The old carried memory, binding present suffering to the lessons of generations past. In their stories, families found strength, even as the body weakened. To lose either was to lose more than a person. It was to lose a thread of continuity. The communal life of villages sometimes softened these losses. Neighbors watched over one another's children, especially when parents fell sick or perished. Elders offered what they could: advice, prayer, or companionship, even when their strength waned. Yet famine strained these bonds, for scarcity often turned cooperation into competition. Hunger tested the very fabric of community, pulling at the ties that bound generations together. Church records describe burials of the young and old in disproportionate numbers during harsh winters. Priests offered comfort, reminding villagers that heaven awaited those who endured suffering on earth. Such faith gave meaning to lives cut short, though grief remained heavy. Families consoled themselves with the belief that their children were angels, their elders saints, rewarded for patience in hardship. Still, there were moments of resilience. Children played even in hunger, fashioning toys from sticks or bones, laughter breaking through the silence of want. Elders told tales by the hearth, recounting saints, battles, and famines overcome. These acts did not fill stomachs, but they nourished spirits, keeping despair at bay. In such moments, survival became more than the absence of death. It became the presence of hope. The fate of children and the elderly in winter reveals the fragility of medieval life. They stood at its edges, most at risk when scarcity struck. Yet within their vulnerability lay the essence of endurance, the willingness to sacrifice, to hope, and to remember. In their lives and in their losses, the struggle of an entire people was written, etched into the long memory of winter. When the earth withheld its harvest and the people's cries rose with hunger, the church gave meaning to suffering through the language of sin and penance. Famine was often preached as divine chastisement, a scourge sent to correct the pride and failings of humankind. Clergy led processions through fields, chanting litanies and raising holy relics in hopes of persuading heaven to relent. For peasants, who lived with little control over nature, these rituals offered a framework that made their trials part of a larger, sacred story. In village churches, priests urged confession and repentance, reminding their congregations that sins of greed, lust, or neglect of holy days angered God. Communities were told to fast, though hunger already pressed heavily upon them, and to pray for forgiveness. The contradiction of asking starving people to abstain from food was not lost, but many complied, for to defy the church was to risk both damnation and social condemnation. Hunger was endured not only as a physical trial, but as a spiritual obligation. Accounts from the period describe special masses held in fields where crops had failed. Crosses were planted in furrows, and holy water sprinkled on barren soil. Villagers gathered barefoot in penance, their faith bound to the hope that heaven might turn its gaze upon them. Though the skies did not always clear, the act itself gave comfort, reminding peasants that they were not abandoned, but seen by God. Monastic chronicles often interpreted weather as a direct sign of divine will. Prolonged rains or sudden frosts were written not simply as natural misfortune, but as warnings to a sinful people. Some abbots declared that famine cleansed souls, humbling the proud and binding the faithful closer to God. This interpretation brought meaning to suffering, even as it offered little relief. To see famine as a trial was to accept that endurance carried eternal reward. Yet not all explanations were comforting. Accusations sometimes fell upon outsiders, strangers, or marginalized groups, blamed for angering God or bringing curses. In some places, Jews or supposed heretics were scapegoated, their persecution fueled by the desperation of hunger. The Church's teachings could both console and condemn, channeling fear into devotion, but also into suspicion. Faith gave resilience, but it also revealed the darker edges of communal fear. Despite the severity of sermons, belief gave peasants strength. Praying together, carrying candles in the darkness, and hearing the familiar words of Scripture bound them to something larger than their immediate want. Even when bellies remained empty, souls felt nourished by ritual. Faith was a tool of survival, not in filling granaries, but in sustaining the will to endure until spring returned. The alignment of natural cycles with spiritual life became deeply ingrained. Villagers marked the hungry gap not only as a season of scarcity, but as a season of trial, woven into the story of salvation. Lent, with its fasting, often coincided with this time, giving theological structure to what was already lived experience. Hunger became part of the calendar of faith, its suffering sanctified through ritual. Thus, famine was never only about food. It was about meaning, about finding light in the bleakest months through the promise of divine providence. The people's endurance was strengthened by their belief that their suffering was not random, but part of a divine order. In that conviction, they found resilience, carrying them through winters that would otherwise have seemed unbearable. In the depths of winter, when hunger bore down hardest, the obligations to lords did not lessen. Peasants still owed rents, labour, and dues, no matter how bare their cupboards grew. Grain was measured out for manorial stores even as families counted crumbs. To live under feudal rule was to know that survival was tethered to the demands of those who owned the land. Lords stood as both protectors and exploiters, holding power that shaped every life within their estates. The manor rolls reveal how merciless this system could be. Even in famine years, peasants were expected to provide the same portion of their harvest, leaving them with almost nothing. The smallest delays or defaults drew fines, adding debt to hunger. Stewards, acting in their lord's name, enforced these rules with precision, writing down each failure as if human suffering were simply an entry in a ledger. Hunger was not only natural, but institutional, built into the very structure of society. Some lords, fearing unrest, released grain from their reserves or reduced rents for a season. Such acts are remembered in chronicles with praise, for they were exceptions rather than the rule. More often, lords sought to profit from scarcity, selling stored grain at inflated prices in nearby markets. The very food that peasants had grown with their hands returned to them only if they could buy it back, a cruel cycle that deepened resentment. The resentment sometimes boiled over. Records describe peasants breaking into granaries, attacking mills, or refusing to pay rents when hunger reached its peak. Rebellions did not spring from ideology alone, but from the gnawing ache of starvation, magnified by the injustice of feudal obligations. The English peasants' revolt of 1381, though sparked by taxes, carried beneath it years of frustration, born from such exploitation. Hunger was the tinder, and unfair demands struck the spark. Exploitation extended beyond grain. Lords controlled forests, rivers, and pastures, restricting peasants from hunting, fishing, or gathering fuel without paying fees. To take a rabbit or a bundle of wood without permission could lead to punishment, even in times of famine. These restrictions tightened the grip of authority, reminding peasants that survival itself was not a right, but a privilege granted at the pleasure of their lord. Yet power was not absolute. Communities pushed back in subtle ways, resisting through small acts of defiance. Peasants might hide part of their harvest, grind grain in secret querns to avoid mildews, or gather firewood at night. These were dangerous choices, but they reflect a quiet resilience, a refusal to yield entirely to exploitation. Their endurance was not only physical, but also rooted in resistance. The chronicles also remind us that lords themselves depended on peasants. Without their labour, fields would remain barren and rents would cease. This interdependence meant that total exploitation risked collapse. Some lords recognized this balance and acted with restraint, but many did not. The thin line between authority and rebellion was constantly tested by the hunger of winter. The story of feudal exploitation is not one of simple cruelty, but of a system where survival and power were unequally divided. Hunger revealed the injustice most starkly, stripping away pretense to show the cost borne by the many for the comfort of the few. Yet even under such weight, peasants endured, carrying within them the quiet strength that allowed their communities to persist through centuries of hardship. When the plague swept through Europe after 1347, its terror was measured not only in death, but also in how it reshaped the balance of survival. Entire villages were emptied, fields left untended, and markets fell silent. The sudden collapse of population meant that mouths to feed diminished drastically. For those who endured, the landscape of hunger shifted, and the scarcity that had once been constant eased, at least for a time. Out of devastation emerged a paradox. Death brought more food to the living. The plague cut deep into the feudal order. Lords who once demanded grain and labor from crowded villages found their tenants gone, their fields overgrown. With fewer peasants to till the soil, wages for laborers rose, and grain stores stretched further among the survivors. Archaeological evidence reveals improved diets in the decades after the first wave, with more meat and wheat bread appearing in common households. Hunger did not vanish, but the pressure eased in ways unimaginable before the plague. Markets reflected this transformation sharply. Grain prices fell as supply exceeded the diminished demand, and peasants who survived gained greater bargaining power. Some moved into abandoned lands, cultivating larger plots than their families had ever known. In this sense, famine receded for many, though the shadow of plague still haunted every transaction. The abundance was fragile, sustained only by the memory of loss and the fear of its return. The absence of labor, however, also created new challenges. With so many dead, entire harvests were left to rot, orchards untended, mills silent. In the immediate aftermath, abundance of land did not always translate into abundance of food. It took years for communities to reorganize, for hands to fill the places left empty. During that transition, hunger still struck in waves, reminding all that survival could never be taken for granted. The church interpreted this shift as divine mystery. Priests preached that famine had been sent to humble, plague to cleanse, and abundance to reward those spared. Yet for peasants, the meaning was more practical. They ate bread of finer grain, drank stronger ale, and tasted meats once reserved for their lords. This change in diet was not luxury, but a long-denied relief, proof that survival had entered a new phase. Feudal lords resisted the loosening of their grip. Laws such as England's Statute of Labourers in 1351 sought to freeze wages and tie workers back to their manners. These measures reveal the fear among elites that with food less scarce and labour more valuable, peasants might escape control. The struggle over food was thus entwined with the struggle over freedom, each reinforcing the other in the century that followed. For ordinary villagers, the plague years became a dividing line. Before, survival was a constant battle against crowded mouths and thin stores. After, though death had thinned their numbers, life offered more generous portions. Fields yielded the same, but fewer hands divided them. Families rebuilt on this altered ground, shaping new traditions of eating, storing, and trading that reflected their changed world. The Black Death altered not only the body of Europe, but its stomach as well. Hunger, once the inescapable rhythm of winter, loosened its grip for a generation. The cost of that relief was terrible beyond measure, but the survivors bore witness to a world where food no longer pressed so cruelly. In their endurance, they carried both grief and unexpected abundance, a reminder that history is written as much in the fields as in the chronicles of kings. When ordinary stores were gone, and even the poorest bread had vanished, peasants turned to what was left, foods never meant to be eaten but forced into service by hunger. Chroniclers record how people boiled nettles, chewed grass, or ground acorns into bitter meal. Bark stripped from trees was dried and crushed to thicken bread, its taste harsh and its nourishment almost none. These famine foods were not chosen, but endured, symbols of desperation written into the daily struggle for life. Acorns, more common in forests, became one of the most frequent substitutes. Ground into coarse flour, they produced loaves dense and astringent, difficult to swallow. Some families leached them in water to lessen the bitterness, though the process required time and fuel they often lacked. Eating such bread was a reminder of how far hunger had pushed them, for what once fed swine now sustained human beings. It was sustenance in form more than in strength. Roots and weeds filled pots when nothing else could be found. Dock leaves, sorrel, and nettles were boiled into thin soups, giving the illusion of nourishment. Chroniclers note that some people even consumed thistles or wild grasses, their bodies weakened further by the lack of true calories. Survival depended on making the inedible edible, a grim creativity born of necessity. To fill the belly, even with emptiness disguised as food, was better than the agony of nothing at all. In some places, leather was cut from old shoes or harnesses, boiled until softened, and chewed for hours. Though it provided no real sustenance, it stilled the hunger pains that gnawed at the body. These acts shocked later generations, yet they reveal the extremity of want during the harshest winters. When even leather became a meal, dignity and despair were joined in a single bite. Records from Jean Froissart and other chroniclers speak of such diets with horror, noting that famine stripped away the boundaries between human and animal food. What once seemed unthinkable became common, repeated across villages where the harvest had failed. These accounts are reminders that hunger reduced life to its most basic question: how to endure one more day. The dignity of cuisine was long forgotten when survival was at stake. The physical toll of these foods was severe. Many caused illness, with stomach pains, weakness, and even poisoning reported. Instead of restoring strength, they often hastened decline, showing that not all food was truly food. Yet desperation left no choice. Parents gave such meals to their children, knowing they might sicken, but unable to face the cries of starvation. Hunger forced hands to do what the heart recoiled from. Despite the suffering, these famine foods carried memory into future generations. Songs and sayings warned of acorn bread years or leather winters, embedding the recollection of scarcity into culture. The shame of such diets was transformed into lessons of caution, urging thrift in abundance and preparation for lean times. The memory of desperation became a tool of resilience, guiding communities long after famine passed. The story of famine foods reveals the extremes of human endurance. They were not meals, but acts of survival, each bite a battle against despair. In the bitter taste of bark bread and the boiled leather of empty winters, one sees the measure of resilience that allowed peasants to survive at all. These desperate diets testify to the will to live, even when the world offered nothing but emptiness. Even as hunger hollowed the body, the people of medieval Europe clung to festivals that brightened the darkest days. Winter brought moments when work paused, and the community gathered to remember abundance, even if only in spirit. Christmas was foremost, a time of worship, but also of feasting when possible. Families shared whatever they had saved, a goose, a loaf of finer bread, or a mug of ale. The celebration lifted hearts, if not bellies, binding neighbors together in joy amid scarcity. Carnival followed in late winter, a burst of color and revelry before the austerity of Lent. Masks, dances, and songs filled villages, even when hunger weighed heavily. The feasting was often modest, yet the symbolism was powerful, a reminder that life still contained laughter. Chroniclers describe how people mocked authority in these days, turning the world upside down with play. Hunger did not vanish, but for a short while, it was silenced beneath music and merriment. Rituals carried hope alongside celebration. Processions wound through snow-dusted fields. Candles and crosses held high as prayers sought divine mercy for future harvests. The people believed that to honor saints and mark holy days would bring relief from famine. Bells rang across valleys, their sound mingling with the winter wind, reminding all that they were not alone in their suffering. The rituals were acts of faith, woven into the rhythm of survival. Communal gatherings offered more than prayer. They gave psychological relief. To dance, sing, or share food, even in small amounts, created a sense of strength. Hunger isolated, but festivals united. Stories were told, carols sung, and plays performed that drew laughter from weary faces. These moments of collective spirit helped villages endure, for despair was lessened when borne together. The church shaped much of this rhythm. Holy days punctuated the agrarian calendar, offering breaks from toil and reminders of divine providence. Even fasting seasons carried meaning, aligning scarcity with sacred practice. Hunger, sanctified by ritual, became more bearable when framed as obedience to God. Through such ceremonies, suffering was transformed into a path of spiritual growth. Food, though scarce, was always central to these occasions. Families saved small portions for feast days, sacrificing in the present to ensure something special could be shared. A pot of meat stew on Christmas or a richer loaf for Epiphany carried immense weight, not for its abundance, but for its symbolism. These meals spoke of hope, that scarcity was not eternal, and that joy could still be tasted. Festivals also strengthened bonds between lord and peasant. Some lords distributed alms or food on holy days, gestures of charity that reinforced loyalty. Monasteries too gave bread at their gates during major feasts, fulfilling both religious duty and communal need. Though often small in scale, these acts wove ties of interdependence that mattered greatly in times of hardship. Amid famine and cold, festivals and rituals did not erase suffering, but they gave meaning and endurance. They reminded peasants that life was more than hunger, that joy and faith could still find a place by the hearth. In these celebrations lay a stubborn defiance, a refusal to let winter have the final word. Through song, prayer, and shared bread, they held fast to hope until the earth softened once more. Behind the walls of manors and castles, stores of grain lay in guarded chambers, set aside from the common harvest. These reserves were meant first for the lord's household, his retainers, and his livestock, yet their presence shaped the fate of entire villages. In times of famine, the question was not whether grain existed, but whether it would be shared. Lords' decisions determined whether hunger would be endured in silence or explode into anger. Reserves were symbols of power. Great wooden bins or stone granaries, carefully sealed against damp and guarded by stewards, held the wealth of the harvest. For peasants who struggled with spoiled pits and meagre barns, these stores represented security beyond their reach. To see grain locked away while their families starved deepened the sense of inequality, turning sustenance into an emblem of domination. Hunger sharpened not only need, but also awareness of injustice. Some lords understood the danger of withholding too long. Records tell of nobles releasing grain during famine, not out of pure charity, but to prevent revolt. Selling at reduced prices or offering portions as relief softened tensions, securing loyalty. Such acts are remembered with rare praise in chronicles, evidence that even small gestures of mercy could change the course of a winter. Yet for every benevolent act, there were many more where profit was chosen instead. More often, grain from reserves was sold at high prices in urban markets, enriching lords while villages starved. Merchants carried sacks to towns where buyers could afford them, leaving peasants to watch their own harvests pass out of reach. The reserve thus became both salvation and curse. Salvation for those with coin, curse for those without. This imbalance etched bitterness deep into the memory of famine years. The presence of reserves also shaped politics. Monarchs and great lords sometimes commanded that stores be opened to prevent unrest across their realms. Chroniclers describe instances when famine threatened rebellion, and rulers intervened with public distributions. These actions reveal that reserves were not merely household wealth, but instruments of governance, their release calculated to preserve order as much as life. For peasants, the reserves represented both hope and frustration. They knew food existed within arm's reach, yet it was guarded by walls and laws. To beg at the manor gate was to place oneself at the mercy of another's decision. Some were granted a measure of grain, others were turned away. The randomness of such mercy left scars deeper than hunger itself, for survival seemed to depend less on labor than on favor. Tales of revolt often feature attacks on granaries, for peasants knew well where the reserves lay. In moments of desperation, doors were broken, and sacks carried off in defiance. These acts were dangerous, punished harshly when discovered, but they reveal the fury that locked grain inspired. Hunger made men bold, and the sight of abundance denied could spark flames of rebellion. The story of Lord's reserves is one of contrasts: security for the few, uncertainty for the many. They embodied the unequal structure of medieval life, where food was both sustenance and instrument of control. When reserves were opened with fairness, they preserved peace. When withheld, they deepened suffering. In the quiet granaries of castles, the fate of countless peasants was silently decided, one winter after another. When hunger pressed too hard and fields lay bare, many peasants sought survival beyond their villages. Seasonal migration became a rhythm of life, as men and sometimes entire families walked miles to towns or wealthier estates in search of work. Records from England and France show streams of labourers moving during winter, offering their strength for wages or food. This movement was not born of choice, but of necessity, driven by the emptiness of home granaries. Labourers found work in varied places. Some hired themselves to large farms, helping tend livestock through the cold months. Others sought employment in towns, carrying loads, repairing roads, or working in construction when weather allowed. Even monasteries employed wandering peasants, offering food and shelter in exchange for toil. The wages were modest, yet a loaf earned abroad often meant survival for families waiting back in the village. Markets of larger towns swelled with these migrants. Chroniclers describe streets crowded with beggars, petitioners, and labourers offering their skills. Competition was fierce, and not all found work. Many resorted to begging, a practice frowned upon, but tolerated in times of famine. To beg was to admit desperation, yet for countless peasants, it was the only option left when labour was refused and hunger persisted. The movement of so many created unease among authorities. Lords feared the loss of their tenants, for empty cottages meant untended fields. Laws were sometimes enacted to bind peasants more tightly to their manors, forbidding them from leaving without permission. Yet hunger often outweighed fear of punishment. To remain meant certain suffering, while the road at least offered the possibility of relief. The journey itself was fraught with hardship. Winter roads were muddy, icy, and unsafe, with robbers preying on the vulnerable. Families carried little with them, their belongings tied in cloth bundles, their feet wrapped in worn shoes. They slept in barns, churches, or beneath hedgerows, enduring cold nights in the hope that morning would bring work. Migration was both risk and lifeline, a gamble played every year by those with no other recourse. Women and children were not absent from this movement. Women might find service in households as laundresses, cooks, or caretakers, while children could be sent to wealthier relatives or monasteries for food and shelter. Such separations left scars, but they preserved lives. In the constant negotiation between family unity and survival, many chose endurance over togetherness, trusting that hardship would one day pass. For some, seasonal labour offered more than temporary relief. It introduced peasants to broader markets, new communities, and opportunities beyond their home village. Over time, this movement loosened the rigid bonds of feudalism, giving peasants a glimpse of autonomy. Though born in suffering, migration planted seeds of change that slowly reshaped medieval society. Seasonal migration tells a story of hunger's reach beyond the hearth. It pushed people onto roads, reshaped families, and altered the balance between peasant and lord. In their journeys, peasants carried both despair and determination, walking mile after mile with the hope that somewhere, somehow, labour would turn into bread. Their steps echoed the persistence of those who refused to yield quietly to famine. In villages pressed by hunger, no one truly survived alone. Families leaned upon neighbours, sharing grain, milk, or firewood when supplies ran thin. These exchanges were rarely formal. They were gestures of necessity, grounded in the knowledge that fortune shifted quickly and any giver might soon become the receiver. To borrow a measure of rye or to lend a goat for milking was to keep not only households alive, but the entire community bound together against winter's cruelty. Court rolls reveal how often disputes arose over such exchanges. Promises of repayment sometimes went unfulfilled, and quarrels over borrowed livestock or missing sacks of grain filled manorial records. Yet, alongside these conflicts was a record of cooperation. Testimonies of shared tools, barns repaired together, or seed lent for the spring sowing. Even when disagreements flared, the underlying truth remained. Survival was collective, not solitary. Festivities and religious observances deepened these ties. Villagers gathered for processions, prayers, and feasts, even in lean years. Sharing food at Christmas or ale at a wedding reinforced bonds that went beyond kinship. Such gatherings reminded peasants that endurance was not merely an individual struggle, but a communal act, one that drew strength from fellowship. Hunger weighed less heavily when carried together. Communal work also reinforced solidarity. Men and women joined forces in ploughing fields, repairing dikes, or clearing roads blocked by snow. These labours were often demanded by lords, yet peasants also worked voluntarily for one another, recognising that a neighbour's failure could endanger all. A collapsed roof, an untended field, or a sick family member required swift assistance, for in neglect lay danger to the whole village. Religion gave spiritual depth to these bonds. To share bread was not only kindness, but a reflection of Christ's commandment to love one another. The poor prayed for those who helped them, and charity was seen as a path to salvation. Faith sanctified the act of giving, transforming the practical need for cooperation into a sacred duty. In this way, survival was tied to both earthly need and heavenly hope. Still, hunger tested solidarity. When supplies dwindled too far, jealousy and suspicion arose. Villagers accused one another of hoarding or theft, and envy fell upon those who seemed better provided for. Such tensions strained community bonds, yet rarely broke them entirely. The need to endure together outweighed division, reminding all that isolation meant certain defeat against famine. Children, too, benefited from these networks. When parents faltered, neighbours stepped in, ensuring little ones received scraps of bread or bowls of pottage. Elders offered wisdom and comfort, passing stories of past famines that showed how cooperation had carried villages through. These lessons imprinted themselves deeply on the young, shaping a culture of endurance rooted in shared memory. The strength of community bonds was perhaps the greatest weapon peasants possessed against hunger. Neither lords' granaries nor market stalls could replace the neighbour who shared firewood, the midwife who tended the sick, or the family that lent seed for spring. In the face of relentless scarcity, these bonds stitched lives together, ensuring that villages endured not just as individuals, but as a whole. The struggle for survival in medieval Europe was bound tightly to the moods of the sky. A single season of drought or flood could undo months of labour, but longer shifts in climate reshaped entire generations. From about 950 to 1250, the land experienced the medieval warm period, when gentler winters and longer summers brought more reliable harvests. Populations grew, villages expanded, and bread was more abundant. Yet by the 14th century, the climate turned harsher, ushering in what would be remembered as the Little Ice Age. The colder years shortened growing seasons, with frosts arriving earlier and lingering later. Heavy rains washed seed from fields, while harsh winters killed livestock left without sufficient shelter. Chroniclers across Europe wrote of ruined crops and rivers frozen for weeks. These changes were not merely inconveniences, but threats that undermined the fragile balance between survival and starvation. A harvest missed by weeks could mean a famine that lasted for years. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 was one of the clearest examples of climate's power. Relentless rain turned fields into swamps, preventing sowing and drowning grain. Hay for animals rotted, leading to mass deaths of cattle and sheep. This catastrophe was not an isolated event, but part of a broader climatic shift, one that made winters harsher and famines more frequent. Climate was not background, but an active force in shaping human endurance. Weather also influenced trade. When storms struck the North Sea, shipments of salted herring failed to reach inland markets, cutting off a vital source of winter food. Harsh winters froze rivers, halting transport of grain between towns. The economy of survival depended not only on fields, but on the ability to move food, and climate placed obstacles at every turn. In this way, nature controlled commerce as firmly as it controlled crops. Communities developed rituals to plead with the heavens. Processions carried relics into rain-soaked fields. Prayers sought the end of storms or the breaking of droughts. The church interpreted these fluctuations as divine will, yet peasants experienced them as a daily gamble. Their faith provided resilience, but the unpredictability of the climate left them anxious with every season, knowing that fortune and famine lay in the shifting winds. The colder turn of the 14th century also reshaped settlement patterns. Marginal lands once used for farming became untenable, forcing families to abandon villages in higher or wetter ground. Archaeological surveys across northern Europe reveal deserted hamlets from this period, their silence a testament to climate's reach. People clustered more tightly where the soil was reliable, intensifying both cooperation and competition for resources. Winters grew longer and harsher, pushing peasants to rely more heavily on preserved foods, hardy vegetables, and fuel for warmth. The memory of milder years haunted them, stories of easier harvests told by elders who had seen different times. Such comparisons deepened the sense of decline, as if the world itself had turned against them. Hope had to be found not in the skies, but in the stubborn will to endure. The story of medieval hunger cannot be told without the story of climate. It was the unseen hand that guided famine, shaping not only the harvest, but the rhythm of daily life. In its warmth, communities thrived. In its chill, they faltered. The resilience of peasants was measured not only in bread baked or fields tilled, but in their ability to withstand the ceaseless changes of weather and time. Hunger did more than weaken bodies. It ignited anger that sometimes burst into rebellion. When obligations pressed hardest and food grew scarce, peasants rose against those who demanded rents and dues despite their misery. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 is remembered for its cries against taxation, yet beneath the slogans lay years of resentment over hunger and exploitation. The sight of granaries locked while bellies ached was a spark that no winter storm could extinguish. The rebellion was not isolated. Across Europe, uprisings flared in moments of famine. In Flanders, France, and Germany, records tell of villages refusing to pay rents or storming manorial stores. These revolts were rarely coordinated, born instead from desperation shared by many. Hunger did not make rebels of all, but it stripped away patience, making the injustice of feudal demands unbearable. When survival was threatened, obedience crumbled. Food was at the heart of these conflicts. To peasants, bread and grain were life itself, while to lords they were measures of wealth and power. When harvests failed, the peasants saw not only nature's cruelty, but human greed keeping sustenance out of reach. Petitions and pleas often went unanswered, leaving rebellion as the final recourse. These acts were not simply political, but deeply human responses to the injustice of starving while food was withheld. Violence was not always the chosen path. Many revolts began with demands for relief, lowered rents, forgiveness of debts, or access to common lands. Chroniclers note how peasants often approached their lords first with requests, only turning to force when denied. Hunger gave urgency to these petitions, transforming grievances that might have been endured in better times into immediate crises. Rebellion was born from the refusal to die quietly. The role of hunger is visible in the timing of unrest. Revolts frequently erupted in spring, when stores were lowest and hope for the new harvest still uncertain. These months, known as the Hungry Gap, were the crucible of resistance. Families had endured the winter but could endure no longer, and their anger spilled into action. The rhythm of revolt followed the rhythm of famine itself. The responses were harsh. Lords and kings met rebellion with brutal reprisals, seeking to restore order through fear. Leaders were executed, villages fined, and promises of reform often broken. Yet even when crushed, the memory of resistance lingered. Hunger had shown peasants their collective strength, and though victory was rare, defiance reshaped the balance between ruler and subject, if only for a time. Revolts also revealed the power of unity. Hunger pressed on all alike, binding neighbors in common cause. Bonds of kinship and community became the foundation of resistance, proving that the same solidarity that preserved life in famine could also fuel rebellion. These uprisings were moments when survival and justice intertwined, when endurance turned to action against the structures that deepened scarcity. The story of peasant revolts is inseparable from the story of hunger. It was not ideology alone, but the ache of empty stomachs that drove men and women to risk everything. Their defiance was a cry for bread as much as for freedom, a reminder that the struggle for survival was always political as well as personal. In their rebellions, hunger found its voice. The memory of famine did not fade when the snows melted. It lived on in the songs sung by villagers, in the proverbs whispered by elders, and in the lessons passed from parent to child. Scarcity carved itself into the culture of medieval Europe, shaping not only the body, but the mind. To waste food was considered sinful, for every crust held the echo of winters when none could be spared. Memory itself became a form of protection against future want. Folklore absorbed these experiences, transforming hunger into stories. Tales of acorn bread years or leather winters warned future generations of the cost of poor harvests and unpreparedness. Ballads spoke of hunger as both punishment and teacher, reminding listeners that resilience was forged in hardship. Even fairy tales that later softened into children's stories often carried within them the shadows of famine, echoes of centuries when hunger walked hand in hand with survival. Agricultural practices too were shaped by memory. Villagers learned to diversify crops, storing not only grain but roots and legumes to withstand the shock of failed harvests. Communal bonds strengthened through shared storage, as distrust of lords' reserves encouraged peasants to secure their own caches. The scars of past winters guided planting decisions, teaching caution where once there had been trust in the cycles of the earth. The church preserved these memories in sermons and chronicles. Famine was recorded as divine warning, ensuring that generations who had not lived through it still heard its lessons from the pulpit. Saints were invoked as protectors against hunger, and prayers for good harvests became embedded in liturgical calendars. In this way, the memory of famine transcended generations, woven into the very rhythm of religious life. Survivors bore their scars visibly. Chroniclers noted how those who had lived through great famines carried habits of thrift long after food was plentiful. They hoarded, rationed, and saved in ways others found excessive, but to them it was wisdom written in hunger. Skeletal remains show signs of stunted growth, proof that famine etched itself onto bones as much as into memory. The body remembered what the mind tried to pass on. Social order, too, was touched by these winters. The distrust of lords and merchants grew deeper in communities that had watched them hoard food during famine. Resistance found its root in hunger, shaping later revolts and demands for fairness. Hunger was not only an event, but a teacher of suspicion, a silent force that altered how peasants viewed power and authority. Even when abundance returned, the memory of hunger tempered joy. Feasts were celebrated with caution, and gratitude was expressed not lightly, but with solemnity. Families who survived spoke of it as survival against odds, a victory won by patience, faith, and endurance. The stories of these winters were not told with pride, but with reverence, acknowledging the cost paid by those who did not live to see spring. The legacy of starvation winters is one of endurance, etched into culture, faith, and the very soil of Europe. It taught resilience, mistrust of abundance, and reverence for the simplest foods. In every loaf baked and every store pit dug, peasants carried the memory of hunger with them. Their survival ensured that the lessons of famine were never forgotten, a shadow cast across centuries of human endurance. Through the long centuries, peasants endured winters that seemed designed to break them. Hunger pressed from one side, cold from the other, yet life continued, held together by determination and resourcefulness. They stretched bread with acorns, simmered endless pots of pottage, and wrapped themselves in patched wool to face nights when frost crept through the walls. Their strategies were not marks of abundance, but of resilience, a daily decision to survive when every force conspired against them. The ingenuity of survival can be seen in the smallest details. Grain pits dug into the earth, herbs gathered before the first snow, milk transformed into hard cheese. Each act was a calculation against the future. Nothing was wasted. Bones flavored stews, rushes softened damp floors, and dung became fuel. These choices did not make life easy, but they kept it possible, transforming scarcity into endurance. Communal bonds strengthened the fight against hunger. Neighbors lent tools, shared scraps, and worked together in the fields, understanding that survival was collective. Charity from monasteries added another thread, a fragile but vital lifeline in years of famine. Even when disputes and tensions flared, the knowledge remained that no household could outlast the winter entirely alone. In solidarity, peasants found strength. Faith carried its own power. To see hunger as trial, punishment, or path to salvation gave meaning to suffering that might otherwise have crushed the spirit. Bells rang through snow-laden fields, calling for prayer, and rituals marked hope for better harvests. Belief in divine providence did not fill empty bellies, but it filled hearts with the courage to endure. In faith, peasants found not relief, but the will to wait for relief. Trade and migration added further means of survival. Some walked miles to markets or towns in search of bread or work, carrying little more than hope. Others bartered wool, tools, or labor for food, reshaping the fragile balance of existence. These movements scattered the seeds of change, showing peasants that their lives, though bound by lords and land, could adapt to forces beyond their control. Hunger forced mobility, and mobility reshaped society. Generational memory preserved the lessons of these trials. Elders told stories of acorn bread years and hungry gaps, ensuring their descendants remembered the cost of forgetting. These memories shaped planting practices, storage habits, and even the reverence shown toward food. Survival was not only an act of the present, but a legacy passed forward, a discipline etched into culture and faith alike. The scars of famine did not erase joy entirely. Even in lean years, festivals brought laughter, and shared meals, however meager, reminded peasants that life was more than hunger. The endurance of song, story, and companionship proved that resilience was not only physical, but emotional. To find hope in the midst of want was itself a victory, one as crucial as bread on the table. The history of peasants surviving starvation winters is a testament to human endurance. Against cold, disease, and exploitation, they bent but did not break. Their strategies may appear humble: coarse bread, smoky huts, shared pots of gruel, yet within them lies the essence of survival. They endured not through strength of arms or wealth, but through patience, ingenuity, and faith. In their quiet resilience, humanity found a way to live against the odds.